Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 5 must-start players for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about a handful of players that you should be reconsidering as startable prospects going into our Week 5 matchups. Again, a lot of the players that I do mention throughout a week in regards to must-start prospects are guys that aren't really being trusted in very many leagues. In fact, all the players that I'm going to mention on today's episode are being started in less than 30% of Yahoo formats. So I wanted to go ahead, give you guys some perspective on a handful of players as to why we should be starting them going into this week, while of course giving you guys statistics that justify the reasons behind why I trust these players going into my matchup. Now, of course, before we get into that, I of course want to mention and go over the results of last week's must-start players. Of course, we had 5 players last week, and we'll talk about that, and we'll give you guys a little bit of perspective as to how that went and how we could have went differently in regards to some of those predictions. Outside of that, before we begin today's content, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel. Of course, with your daily viewership and clicking the like button down below does certainly help the channel out a lot. For those of you who have yet to do so, be sure to subscribe. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season with the singular goal of not only helping you win your Week 5 matchup, but of course, winning a 2022 fantasy football championship. So take 2 seconds out of your day. Help us get to our goal of 70,000 subscribers. We're very close. We greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 5 must-starts, but of course, with our Week 4 results. Last week, we mentioned these 5 players as potential must-start candidates: Rashad Penny, Greg Dortch, Joshua Palmer, Russell Gage, and Josh Reynolds. Now, I do want to give you a little bit of a breakdown. All of them, of course, were being started in less than 30% of leagues, and the only 2 performances that we saw that were great were Rashad Penny, who had a monster performance against one of the easiest run-stopping defenses in the league. In fact, the Detroit Lions continue to give up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. That was anticipated. While on the other end, of course, in that same matchup, Josh Reynolds went for 17.6 fantasy points, having himself a fantastic game due to the fact that there was no DeAndre Swift, no Amon-Ra St. Brown, no DJ Chark. That may be a little bit different this upcoming week, but either way, the fact that the Detroit Lions' offensive efforts led to 45 points, obviously, Josh Reynolds was going to eventually go ahead and find himself in the end zone. Now, let's talk about some of the other prospects that didn't pan out well. Of course, Russell Gage, in my opinion, it's a push, mainly because I was suggesting him under the contingency of Chris Godwin and Julio Jones not being active, because both were questionable and both hadn't practiced at a full capacity by Friday. So I'm going to push that one. And perhaps you see that as me trying to salvage my record. Trust me, I'm not trying to. I'm just giving you guys some perspective. As for Greg Dortch, I'll take the L on that. Rondale Moore was active, and even though I knew he was going to be active, I still suggested Greg Dortch at a pretty high capacity, considering his performances of being a top 36 wide receiver for the first 3 consecutive weeks of the 2022 season. Yet, as soon as Rondale Moore showed up, he played 80% of the snaps and had himself 5 targets, 3 receptions, and 11 receiving yards. I'm pretty sure Greg Dortch could have put up better numbers, but it is what it is, and Rondale Moore is even questionable going into this upcoming week, so Greg Dortch might end up actually being a decent option against Philadelphia this week, we'll end up seeing. But either way, Joshua Palmer, the other player I wanted to mention, even though Keenan Allen was out last week and is going to continue to be out, don't let that scare you. Joshua Palmer did sustain an ankle injury in the first half, and in going into the second half, he was late to come out of the locker room. There's a lot of context behind that, which may give you a little bit of an understanding as to why he wasn't very relevant in the second half of that game and wasn't able to continue to get it going in terms of the receiving work. So either way, a 2-2-1 record. That would take our season record to 11-10-1 with a singular push of Russell Gage. Now, to be honest, when I look at my results as of late, there are players that in weeks past, I've mentioned, hey, they're going to be great. And then in that given week, they don't play well. And in every subsequent week after, like a Ramondre Stevenson, maybe even like we talked about Alan Lazard a couple weeks back. These guys, ever since I've mentioned them and, completely killed me in that given week, have ever since continued to play well. So maybe the prophecies are true, but they're just delayed to an extent. Speaking of Ramondre Stevenson, I did want to mention a couple things. Guys, I do mention must-start players that are being started in a low capacity of leagues because they are players on that fringe. Again, if you're looking for players that you just have to start every single week, the players on the screen that I'm presenting right now, like a Ramondre Stevenson, a Damian Harris, James Robinson, Dallas Goedert, these are the guys that are must-start players. Obviously, they have to be in your lineup this week, right? There's no question about it, mainly because, of course, Damian Harris, Ramondre Stevenson, they have the easiest matchup at the running back position, as the Detroit Lions thus far this season on average are giving up nearly 24 points per game in a half PPR to opposing running backs, just off rushing statistics alone. They've given up 467 rushing yards and 8 rushing touchdowns just in 4 games. Yet, for some reason, Damian Harris is only being started in 53% of leagues, while Ramondre Stevenson's only being started in 52% of leagues. I don't care that Zappi, the rookie third-string quarterback, is going to be starting for the New England Patriots this week. They're a run-first team, and those numbers in the 50s should more or less look like the 60s, 70s, if not 100%, because I'm so confident in their production. Same thing with James Robinson. How is he only being started in 77% of leagues? I mean, he plays against Houston. That's the second easiest matchup. They're giving up 21.6 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Let's talk about Dallas Goedert. The fact that even his number is in the realm of possibility of only 87% boggles my mind. Maybe it's 4-man leagues. That's the reason why his percentages have gone down. But he plays against one of the easiest matchups of the position, Arizona, who have given up 16.5 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And of course, Dallas Goedert already thus far this season has been on that 9 to 10 point range every single week. I think a very nuclear performance could be in store for us as Dallas Goedert and the Philadelphia Eagles take on the Arizona Cardinals defense, who have given up the second most points to the position. You know, when I was doing some research before this, I also saw players like Romeo Doubs only being started in 26% of leagues. Guys, back-to-back weeks of 8+ targets, back-to-back weeks of a touchdown. I can't name him because I've already made him one of my must-starts earlier this year. I want to keep it fresh. But come on, what are we doing? Drake London only being started in 35% of Yahoo leagues? What are we doing here? There's no Cordero Patterson. There's no Kyle Pitts. Start him up. Let's go. Either way, let's get into the conversation, beginning with our Week 5 must-starts. And the thumbnail for today's video, it is Robert Woods of the Tennessee Titans. We mentioned Robert Woods a couple days ago in our wide receiver rankings video because of how much potential he has in the incredible matchup. So let's give you some context. In the last 2 weeks, Robert Woods has been an active part of this offense, specifically in week 3, 9 targets that led to 4 catches, 85 receiving yards, and 10.5 half PPR fantasy points. While the week after, he had himself another great performance in which he also had 4 receptions, this time on 4 targets, 30 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown against the Indianapolis Colts secondary, who many of us saw last night completely lock down Russell Wilson. Either way, that performance for Robert Woods led to 11 fantasy points, which has continued to make him a relevant option and a potential starting option for many of us, especially for those of us who play in leagues where we can start 3 starting wide receivers. This could be a perfect wide receiver 2-3 opportunity for us. And for those of you who have lesser wide receiver depth, wide receiver 2 option with upside could be in store for us considering the matchup. This upcoming week, they take on the Washington Commanders. In terms of DVOA, they're 30th in terms of pass defense. The Commanders have also allowed the 3rd most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average, 38.35 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. They've also allowed 10 passing touchdowns by opposing quarterbacks this season. Just talking about some of the wide receiver performances that have been put up against them. CeeDee Lamb, 6 catches, 97 and a touchdown, 18.7 half PPR fantasy points. We saw Devonta Smith in week 3, 8 catches, 169 and a touchdown, 26.9 fantasy points. Amon-Ra St. Brown in week 2, 9 catches, 116, 2 touchdowns, 34.9 fantasy points. And of course, week 1, Christian Kirk, 6 receptions, 117 receiving yards, and 14.7 fantasy points. I mean, of course, we have seen wide receivers continue to dominate this defense, and the fact that Treylon Burks is dealing with that turf toe injury, has yet to practice all week long, and is anticipated to miss this upcoming weekend's game, it leads me to believe that not only is Ryan Tannehill going to look for Robert Woods to be the number 1, he is going to solidify himself as the number 1 wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans offense, and he's going to go ahead and bring us home a lot of fantasy points. A player that is currently being started only 30% at least, just on that cusp. We want to go ahead and fire him up for this upcoming week. Moving on to Tyler Conklin. Now, when we've mentioned Tyler Conklin, it has typically been in the setting of a Waiver Wire Monday episode. But in this current circumstance, again, for those of you who are struggling at the tight end position, maybe you've had Kyle Pitts for the last 4 weeks and have been brutalized by his lack of touches and lack of fantasy production, you need to look for another tight end option. And if Tyler Conklin is still available for you, by all means, he should be picked up and played. He's only being started in 24% of leagues, which is shocking to me. I understand that he is going to see less targets now that they've transitioned from Joe Flacco to Zach Wilson, but let's put this in perspective. In the first 4 weeks of the season, his overall productivity in fantasy points, half PPR, 9.6, 7.0, 12.4, 6.7. Though those numbers aren't incredible, they're going to get the job done for us. It's far better than having a tight end that is only getting us 3 to 4 points in a given week. And the fact that they take on the Miami Dolphins this week gives me that much more confidence in the potential upside of one Tyler Conklin. Let's put this in perspective. The Dolphins thus far this season have given up 34 targets, 28 receptions, 292 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns to opposing tight ends. That goes and averages out to 13.8 fantasy points per week to opposing tight ends. In terms of where that ranks amongst all teams in the National Football League, that's the 5th most targets, 4th most receptions, 5th most receiving yards, and 7th most receiving touchdowns allowed to opposing tight ends. There is a reason teams continue to utilize the tight end position against this defense is because they all see it on film. There are opportunities to be had. These linebackers cannot cover, and their safeties at times do not play as well as they should. Overall, there's a lot of potential here for Tyler Conklin in this in-division matchup within the AFC East. I think there's a fantastic opportunity here. And let's not forget, some of the other tight ends that have played against this defense, they haven't been incredible. I mean, when we look at the Patriots, they put up 7.8 as a combination of Henry and Jonnu Smith. Of course, the Baltimore Ravens, they went for 27.5 fantasy points, a combination of course, Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. The Buffalo Bills, 7.7 fantasy points against this defense. And then just this last week, of course, Hayden Hurst leading the pack, 12.5 fantasy points against Cincinnati Bengals. A lot of opportunity to be had here going into this upcoming week. Tyler Conklin, available, potentially startable for you this week. Moving on to Devin Duvernay. Now, the last time I mentioned Devin Duvernay in any sort of capacity, it was in regards to completely trading him away. Because yes, he had an incredible hot start in the beginning, and the fantasy points may trick some fantasy managers, but overall, his production and his opportunity don't really line up in terms of fantasy points. So, last time I talked about him, I was saying, let's get rid of him. If in fact, he is somehow available or still on your bench, he's currently only being started in 13% of leagues, but the reason why I want to mention him is because Rashad Bateman is going to be out for week 5 in this matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals. And like I've talked it up all week long, the Cincinnati Bengals should be able to brutalize this secondary for the Baltimore Ravens, similar to the way that they did late last season, in which they scored 41 points per game against that defense in the 2 matchups against one another. So if in fact we're going to see Rashad Bateman out this upcoming week, and we're talking about Devin Duvernay stepping up as the wide receiver 1 potential option, having played only 50% of the offensive snaps thus far this season in every single game, DeMarcus Robinson, sure, J.K. Dobbins, Mark Andrews, but outside of Andrews, really there isn't much of a guarantee for a receiver getting target opportunity within this offense. Not only does Devin Duvernay have the ability to score touchdowns because he's already scored 4 this season, 3 on offense, 1 on special teams. In terms of his fantasy point productivity, he's still a pretty good option. 19.4, 11.2, 9.3, and 7.1. For those of you who are in a deeper league and are struggling to find some sort of fill-in option as a wide receiver 3 that has potential upside, and if certainly you play in a league where the fantasy point scoring structure allows you to accumulate yardage in terms of return yards towards your overall fantasy point productivity, Devin Duvernay becomes a relevant option in said category. And going into this week, in my opinion, could be a must-start player. Moving on to the final player I wanted to mention. Okay, now I might be getting a little bit too cute with it, but I'm just going to do this, okay? Because I do it for myself. I enjoy talking about these players, and I want to talk about Isiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs. Let me just put this in perspective. Here is the narrative that I'm going to spin, and if in fact it blows up in my face, it blows up in my face. I would like to preface by saying, please do not start Isiah Pacheco unless you are playing in a 16-team league and you're horribly desperate for running backs. And the reason why I say this is because, again, this is a running back that quite frankly cannot be trusted because of the opportunities that he has been given. That being said, we have seen twice this season already him surpass 10 plus touches in a game. Week 1, and of course most recently in week 4 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now both those games, week 1 and week 4, had in common the fact that the Kansas City Chiefs came out and blew out the opposing team in the first half. And because they mounted such a high lead, they wanted to go ahead and run the ball and kill clock in the second half in order to escape the contest. And that's what I'm expecting to see this upcoming week against the Las Vegas Raiders. Let's just put this in perspective. We all saw that Thursday night game yesterday, or whenever you're watching this, we saw that Thursday night performance from Russell Wilson. If Russell Wilson can play well against the Las Vegas Raiders defense, imagine what Patrick Mahomes is going to do. Now, to give you a little bit of a taste as to what kind of potential I'm expecting, of course, besides the fact that the Kansas City Chiefs have beaten the Las Vegas Raiders in 7 of their last 8 meetings, the fact that last season, this team beat the Las Vegas Raiders 41-14 and 48-9. A total score for and against of 89-21. That in itself may give you a little bit of an understanding as to where I'm leaning towards here. I'm expecting Patrick Mahomes and this team to come out, mount an early lead, boat race this team to the point where they have to go ahead and run the ball for the entirety of the second half, not with Clyde Edwards, not with Jerick McKinnon, but with Isiah Pacheco, because they prefer to utilize the rookie running back as someone that they can kill clock with, who is certainly capable of gaining yards after contact. Now, if we rewind back to last season, in one of those games in which we saw the Las Vegas Raiders taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. Kansas City Chiefs, of course, mounted a massive lead in Week 14. And Clyde Edwards-Helaire in that contest, with 2 rushing touchdowns, had 17.7 fantasy points. Okay, you expect that from a running back, especially when your team is scoring 40 points in a given week. But in that same contest, Derek Gore, 9 rushing attempts, 66 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 2 targets, 2 catches, 23 yards, 15.9 fantasy points. Wow, okay, so you had 2 relevant running backs in that matchup as they were running through that Las Vegas Raiders defense. That wasn't all. They had a third running back surpass 10 fantasy points in that game. Darrell Williams, 2 attempts, 8 rushing yards, 0 rushing touchdowns, but 3 targets, 3 catches, 31 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown, 11.4 fantasy points. So a combination of 3 running backs with over 10 fantasy points and a half PPR dumped on that Las Vegas Raiders defense last year, Week 14. Just putting it out there, that is why I'm expecting Isiah Pacheco to surpass 10 rushing attempts, get himself a bunch of utilization in the second half, and be a relevant fantasy option just in that regard. Just putting it out there, it's super risky. Probably don't do it. Just leave it alone. Just, I'm just doing this for myself, just to see if I'm correct. You know what I mean? I'm testing myself, testing the limits. Again, I appreciate you guys watching today's episode. If you like today's content, be sure to click the like button down below. And of course, subscribe if you have not yet already. We're making fantasy football content every single day in order to help you guys win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Of course, for those of you who are looking for your questions answered and or rankings, you can check out Patreon, or you can join us tomorrow afternoon. We'll be talking about from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll be live streaming here on the channel, answering some starter sit questions, as we'll have a little bit more of an understanding as to some of the injuries that have taken place going into Week 5 and who we're going to potentially be trusting. Of course, Sunday morning, like we do every Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, kickoff with Kirchhoff. We'll be live streaming here on the channel with updated rankings on screen. Updated rankings for top 36 running backs, wide receivers, top 16 quarterbacks, and tight ends. So for those of you who are interested in getting your lineups ready to go right before kickoff, join us, Kickoff with Kirchhoff, Sunday mornings here on the channel. Thank you very much. All right, guys, until next time, tomorrow afternoon, hopefully see you there. I'll see you guys. Peace.